The mediation room at the Lakeview Community Center in Sudbury smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, and I sat at one end of a folding table with a manila envelope in front of me and 4 years of not explaining myself pressing quietly against my ribs. My mother sat at the other end with my aunt beside her. Their family lawyer, a tall man named Mr. Kowalski, who wore the expression of someone billing by the hour and not unhappy about it, sat to her left. My mother had not looked at me since I walked in. My aunt had. The way you look at something you've already decided is broken. I had driven up from Toronto the night before. 7 hours with the radio off, stopping once for gas outside Barrie, watching the highway go dark around me. I had not been back to Sudbury in 4 years. Not since my grandmother's funeral, which I did not attend because I was 3 days out of a hospital bed and no one had told me she was sick until she was already gone. That was the last thing my mother said to me before she stopped saying anything at all. That I hadn't come, that I hadn't been there. She said it at a family dinner 2 months later, in front of my aunt and two cousins and a plate of cabbage rolls going cold in the middle of the table. She said I had always put myself first. That I was, in the end, a daughter she had stopped counting on a long time ago. I did not argue. I picked up my jacket and left and drove back to Toronto in the dark, and I did not call after that, and neither did she. My grandmother's name was Elfida, though she went by Betty to everyone who didn't know her well, and to everyone who did. She had come to Sudbury from Poland in 1971 with $40, a suitcase, and a working knowledge of 3 languages, one of which she would spend the rest of her life insisting wasn't really Russian. She had cleaned houses, then managed a cleaning company, then owned it. She had bought a 2-bedroom house on Elm Street with a vegetable garden and a back porch, where she drank her tea every morning regardless of temperature. She was the kind of woman who remembered what you said 2 years ago and held you to it quietly without ever making you feel accused. She used to call me on Sunday evenings, not to talk about anything particular, just to hear my voice, she said, and to tell me what was growing in the garden. In the last 2 years before she died, she called more often. She never said she was unwell. She talked about the tomatoes and a blue jay that kept coming to the feeder and a book she was reading for the second time, because she'd forgotten the ending. I would sit on my apartment floor with the phone pressed against my ear and feel, for that half hour, like someone was glad I existed. When she died, I found out from a cousin's Facebook post. My mother had been her daughter, but they had always had the particular friction of two women who are too similar to be comfortable. My grandmother had not disapproved of my mother's choices exactly. She just had opinions, and she expressed them with the clarity of someone who believed that honesty was a form of love even when it didn't feel like one. The house on Elm Street went to me. Her will said so plainly. The property and its contents, minus a short list of items for my mother and aunt, were to pass to me. Her solicitor, a woman named Ms. Beaumont, called me on a Wednesday morning in October and read me the relevant sections in a measured voice. I sat at my kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. I had not known. I want to be clear about that. My grandmother had never mentioned it, not once, and I had not been expecting anything. The house on Elm Street was the only place in Sudbury I had ever felt like I could breathe all the way in. But I had not let myself think about it as something I would ever have again. My mother found out within the week. She did not call me. She had Mr. Kowalski send a letter to Ms. Beaumont's office formally disputing the will on the grounds that my grandmother had been, in his carefully chosen phrase, subject to undue influence in her final months. There was a second claim about my absence from the family during a period of significant need. The letter suggested I had effectively abandoned my responsibilities as a granddaughter and as a member of the family, and that the bequest did not reflect my grandmother's true intentions. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in the manila envelope with everything else and went back to work. The mediation was my idea. Mr. Kowalski had suggested litigation. Miss Beaumont had suggested mediation first as the less expensive and less damaging option. I had agreed immediately, not because I thought it would be easy, but because I wanted to look at my mother across a table and let her say what she thought was true, and then I wanted to set the record straight. I had spent 4 years not explaining myself. I was tired of it. The mediator's name was Mr. Okafor, a quiet man in his 60s with reading glasses on a cord around his neck. He opened the session by explaining the ground rules with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times and expected nothing to surprise him. Mr. Kowalski went first. He had prepared well. My mother and aunt had provided detailed accounts of the years I had been gone, the missed Christmases, the unreturned calls, my grandmother's declining health in her final year, during which, he noted, I had not once made the drive from Toronto. He talked about family obligation and community of care and what it means to be present. He had a word for what I had done, which was to absent myself from the people who needed me, and he said it in the tone of someone making a reasonable observation rather than an accusation, which is somehow worse. My aunt asked to speak. She had the posture of someone who had been waiting a long time for this room. She talked about the worry, about my mother sitting by the phone, about the years of wondering whether I was safe, whether I was well, whether I would ever come back. She was not entirely wrong about any of it, and then she turned to look at me directly and her voice changed into something she had been keeping somewhere for a long time. She said that I had always been the difficult one, that my grandmother had spoiled me and I had taken advantage of a kind old woman's affection, that I had been absent when it mattered and convenient when there was something to gain, that whatever my grandmother had believed about me, the rest of the family knew what I actually was. She did not say the word selfish, she said several words that meant the same thing. The room was quiet. Mr. Okafor made a note. He looked at the envelope on the table in front of me. My mother had not spoken yet. She spoke now. Her voice was measured in the way voices are when someone has practiced. She said that she had not expected anything from me for years, that she had made her peace with my absence. But then she said something she had clearly been holding for a long time, and the room gave her space to release it. She said that I had always had opportunities and wasted them, that I had been given support and chosen to disappear, that in the end I had come back only for what I could take, and that my grandmother, who had always seen the best in people to the point of naivety, had been taken in by the only person in the family who knew how to play her. She looked at me once while she said it. Once. Mr. Okafor waited a moment after she finished. Then he looked at me and asked, quietly, whether I had documentation I wanted to submit. I brought the envelope to him. Inside was the correspondence. 4 years of letters between my grandmother and me, actual letters because she had never trusted email written on paper and sent through Canada Post. Most of them had notes in her handwriting in the margins, arrows pointing to things I'd written, short comments, sometimes just a check mark next to a paragraph, which was her way of saying, yes, this is right, I understand. There were the Interac records. Every 2 months for 3.5 years, a transfer from my account to hers. Not large amounts, but consistent. I had started when she mentioned offhandedly that the property tax was going up and she wasn't sure she'd budgeted for it. I had not made a thing of it. I had just started sending money. She had never mentioned it to anyone, apparently. There was a letter from my employer on official letterhead. I had worked for the past 5 years as a senior policy analyst with the federal government, Health Canada, based in Toronto, with a file list that covered 3 provinces. The letter confirmed my employment, my role, and because my direct supervisor had written it, and she is the kind of person who is thorough, a brief description of the scope of my work. There was also a letter from the hospital, the one where I had spent 3 days in the fall of the year my grandmother died. I had not been in Toronto, choosing not to come to the funeral. I had been in a hospital bed following a surgical complication that my doctor had classified as serious. I had not told my family because I did not have the kind of family you tell things to. I had not wanted to make it about me. Mr. Okafor read through everything slowly. He paused at the bank records. He paused longer at the hospital letter. He set it down and looked across the table. He said to Mr. Kowalski in a tone that was not unkind but was not soft either, "The claim of abandonment appears to rest on an assumption about the respondent's circumstances that may not be accurate. He said it the way you say something true that is also sufficient." My aunt looked at the papers. My mother looked at me. Mr. Kowalski said that personal circumstances did not necessarily affect the legal question of undue influence. Mr. Okafor agreed with him. He also noted that the correspondence in front of him demonstrated a consistent, documented relationship between my grandmother and me over the period in question, including financial contributions to the estate, and that the picture he had been presented with at the start of the session appeared to be incomplete. My mother said she hadn't known about the hospital. I looked at her. "I know," I said. She said she hadn't known about the transfers either. I said I hadn't told her. She said, and her voice was different now, quieter and less practiced, "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without being cruel. I said, "Because every time I tried to tell you something about my life, it became an argument about your expectations. After a while, I stopped trying." She didn't respond right away. My aunt looked at the table. Mr. Kowalski had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man recalibrating his position. He asked for a brief recess. In the hallway, I stood by the window and looked out at the parking lot. The trees along the edge of it were bare. Sudbury in November is a specific kind of gray that I have always found more honest than beautiful. My grandmother used to say that the city had earned its landscape, that it had been stripped down once and had decided to grow back differently. I thought about her on the back porch with her tea in the cold, watching something happen in the garden. When we came back, Mr. Kowalski said his clients were withdrawing the formal dispute. He said it in a tone that suggested this had not been his preference. Mr. Okafor acknowledged the withdrawal and noted that the property and estate documents would proceed as written. That was it, legally. The room emptied slowly. Mr. Kowalski left first. Mr. Okafor gathered his notes and stepped out with a brief nod to me. My aunt stood up, and for a moment I thought she would leave without speaking. She didn't. She looked at me and said that she had not known about the hospital. I told her it was all right. It wasn't entirely all right, but I was tired, and she looked tired, and there was nothing useful in making her hold something heavier right now. My mother was still seated. I picked up my envelope and stood there. She said, "The house should go to you." She said it plainly, without looking for credit. I didn't know she would do that. She said it was what your grandmother wanted, and she knew her better than I did, apparently. That last part had some bitterness in it. I didn't argue with it. I said I was going to stay up in Sudbury for a few days to go through the house. I said if she wanted to come by, she was welcome. I said I thought my grandmother would have wanted that. My mother nodded. She picked up her coat. On her way to the door, she stopped and said, "I shouldn't have said what I said at that dinner. 4 years ago. About you not being there." I said, "I know." She said, "I was grieving and I was angry and I aimed it at you because you were gone and I didn't understand why." I said, "I know that too." She left. I drove to Elm Street alone and let myself in with the key Miss Beaumont had mailed me. The house smelled like cedar and something faintly floral, a hand soap my grandmother had always kept by the kitchen sink. Her reading glasses were on the table by the front window. There was a half-finished crossword on the coffee table, 3 letters missing from 22 down. I sat down in her armchair and looked at the room. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes after you have been carrying something for years and the weight is finally set down. It does not feel like winning. It feels like standing still for the first time in a long time and noticing how much the stillness costs. My grandmother used to say that the people who leave are not always the ones who stopped caring. Sometimes they're the ones who cared so much that staying was destroying them, and they had to choose between themselves and the people who couldn't see what they were doing. She said this to me once, on the phone in the year I left. I don't know if she was talking about me or about herself at some earlier point in her life. With her, it was often both. 3 days later, my mother came to the house. She brought my aunt. They stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, looking at the room the way you look at something you thought you understood and are now seeing differently. We spent the afternoon sorting through the kitchen cupboards. My mother knew which dishes were from Poland and which had been bought at the Walmart on La Salle. She knew which of the mugs my grandmother had liked and which had been gifts she'd kept out of politeness. My aunt knew where the extra linens were and that the chest freezer in the basement had a latch that stuck. We didn't talk about the mediation. We talked about the dishes. About a summer visit when I was 9, when my grandmother had let me help make pierogi and I'd pressed them wrong and she'd corrected my hands gently without saying I'd done it badly. My mother laughed at that. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. 4 years and a lot of words said in the wrong rooms don't resolve over a box of my grandmother's dishes. I'm not going to tell you they did. But my mother picked up the crossword from the coffee table before she left and filled in 22 down without looking it up. She set it back down carefully in the same spot. I stood on the back porch after they left and looked at the vegetable garden, dormant now, the soil turned over and covered for winter. My grandmother had known which seeds to save and which to let go, and she had done it every fall without ceremony, just attention. I don't know yet what happens next between my mother and me. I know that the door is open and that neither of us has locked it, which is more than I could say a week ago. I know that I am going to fix up the back porch and plant something in the spring, and that on Sunday evenings I am going to feel the specific quiet of a phone that isn't going to ring with her voice on the other end of it. I know that she knew me, and I know that she left me something she thought I needed, not as a gift exactly, but as a reminder that I had been here, that I had been worth something to someone who did not give that away easily. If you have someone in your life you think you understand completely, a parent, a sibling, a child you haven't spoken to in longer than you want to admit, I want to ask you one thing. Not what happened, not who was right, just this. Do you know what their life has actually looked like while you've been apart? Not what you imagined, not what you feared, what it actually looked like. Because the gap between those two things is where most of the grief lives. And sometimes the only way across it is to ask. I keep thinking about the crossword on my grandmother's coffee table. 22 down, 3 letters missing. My mother filled it in before she left without looking it up and set it back exactly where it had been. She didn't say anything about it, neither did I. But I noticed, and I think she knew I noticed, and that small thing felt like the beginning of a language we hadn't spoken in a long time. I've spent a lot of years being misread, not maliciously mostly, just the way people misread things when they stop looking closely and start filling in the blanks with what they expect to find. My family looked at my absence and saw indifference. They saw someone who had taken what she needed and disappeared. They had a story about me, and they had told it to themselves for long enough that it had started to feel like fact. What I've learned, not from that room, but from everything that led to it, is that silence has consequences. Not just the silence of not speaking, but the silence of not correcting. Every time I chose not to explain myself, I was also choosing to let the wrong version of me stand unchallenged. I thought I was protecting my dignity. In some ways I was. But I was also handing people a story with no ending and watching them write one I wouldn't have chosen. My grandmother understood something about integrity that I didn't fully grasp until I was sitting in her chair in her house after everything. She kept every letter. She kept the records of what I sent her. Not because she expected a dispute. She kept them because she believed that what people actually do matters more than what other people say about them, and she wanted there to be evidence of the truth. That is a kind of moral clarity I am still learning to practice. She didn't announce her values. She just acted on them, quietly over decades, and the evidence accumulated. There's something I want to say carefully here because I think it's easy to take the wrong lesson from a story like this. The documents in that envelope weren't what made me worth something. I was worth something before Mr. Okafor read a single page. What the documents did was make it harder for a room full of people to pretend otherwise. The intelligence I'd built over years, not just academic or professional, but the intelligence of knowing how to observe, how to document, how to keep records of reality. That wasn't luck. That was years of paying attention and taking things seriously even when no one was watching. And the part nobody talks about staying. Not staying in a place that was hurting you, but staying with yourself. Not drinking yourself into someone else's version of your story. Not disappearing into bitterness. Getting up and going to work and sending the transfers every 2 months and writing the letters even when you didn't know if they were landing anywhere. That took something. I don't have a tidy word for it. Stubbornness, maybe. The refusal to become what they thought you already were. I planted something in the garden at Elm Street last spring, nothing complicated. Just tomatoes because I knew where the south light came in. My grandmother would have had opinions about my technique. I think about that sometimes and it makes me smile and then it makes my chest ache and then I go back to work. That's how it goes, not resolved, just continuing.